Hello and welcome to Wolt Tech Talks podcast. My name is Jerry and today I'm joined with Andrei Nevedomskii, who is our Kotlin Competence Lead. Today we will be talking about Kotlin Backend development at Wolt. And for those who have been listening our podcast before, maybe you remember that the very first episode was named Adopting Kotlin. That was recorded around 2 years ago. This will be like a nice continuum for that. Things have evolved quite a lot during the past couple of years. Today we will be talking about what kind of Kotlin backend services we have at Wolt nowadays, how's the developer experience, especially what kind of internal tooling we have built, both to increase the velocity and the quality of the backends we built with Kotlin. And who would be a better person to talk these things through than Andrei? So Andrei, welcome to the show. Could you start by introducing yourself?
Hello. Yep, I'm Andrei, the Competence Lead of Kotlin here at Wolt. Nice to meet you all.
Great. You mentioned Competence Lead role. What does it consist of? I guess it's not a industry standard role, so to say.
Yeah, definitely not a typical role you'd see in every company. So it consists of a hiring aspect, like, for example, one of the things we've been doing with Yevo, by the way, is introducing a new backend assignment for our engineers, for our candidates. That's one of the aspects. Another aspect is knowledge sharing, both internal and external. And apart from that, also, of course, helping the engineering community within the company by answering their questions or sharing best practices and stuff like that.
Yeah, I'm sure we will talk about the best practices that you have kind of codified into tooling so that they are taken into use a bit later on. What's your own background in software engineering? How did you end up writing Kotlin backends?
So I've been working in IT for the past 14 years. Initially started as a sysadmin, but then realized that I enjoy writing software more. Been writing mostly backend, initially in Java, and then around 5 years ago, I think, or maybe that would be 6 years already, started using Kotlin, and since then I've been writing Kotlin exclusively. So yeah, that's how it happened.
I'm sure we will get back to the Java versus Kotlin down the line. I think that's one interesting aspect to cover, but maybe let's proceed to the, so to say, basics of Kotlin at Wolt. So what kind of scale are we talking about? How many people are actively developing Kotlin and how many backend services we have at the moment?
So according to the stats we have in GitHub, we have more than 100 services deployed, and we have around 150 monthly contributors to our Kotlin projects. And we also have around 30 of those are building our Android app. So yeah, and we also have a Kotlin knowledge channel where we share all our knowledge, and there we have around 260 people, I think, at the moment.
Yep. So more than 150 Kotlin altogether, like people developing Kotlin, out of which around 30 focusing on Android, and probably all the rest are backend focused. And like mentioned in this podcast, we will dive into the backend aspect of Kotlin. In which part of the organization Kotlin is being used in the backend? And excellent if you can give some concrete examples of what kind of services each domain is building Kotlin with.
Yeah, I would say at this point, Kotlin is used all around Wolt in all of its parts. Like initially it started all in fintech, And at the moment in fintech, we have Kotlin used in invoicing service, tax reporting, integration with tax authorities, payment processing, like all the fintech stuff. Apart from that, we also have Kotlin used in our retail platforms, basically in Wolt market inventory management, item catalog, pricing. In terms of merchant things, we have merchant onboarding backend written in Kotlin. We also have it's used in imaging tech, basically asset repository is in Kotlin, and asset management service is also in Kotlin. Our ads are also served by Kotlin services, and it's get more and more used in consumer backends and courier domain. So yeah, all around world.
Yeah, good say so. And in addition to Kotlin, maybe worth mentioning that the biggest backend languages that we have are Python and Scala. Scala mainly used in the courier domain, and while Python especially in the consumer-facing backends. But Kotlin is the one that has grown fastest during the recent years, and I believe it starts to be on par with Python, which used to be the biggest one considering backends. So one could say that we have been betting on Kotlin during the past couple of years. What would you say are the kind of selling points of Kotlin, for example, compared to these alternative backend languages that we have had in use?
I guess one of the main reasons to start using Kotlin was its type safety. It's probably its biggest advantage in comparison to Python. Another reason was performance. Python being an interpreted language has its hit on performance. And in comparison to Scala, I guess it was ease of use and its Java interop. And also basically talent availability, because engineers with Java background usually can adopt Kotlin quite easily. So it's a bit easier to find talent.
And also, I guess, especially recently, some of the previously only or Python-focused developers who didn't even have any JVM background have been recently moving or started developing Kotlin in their teams. And well, I'm sure our internal tooling is one of the reasons or one of the enablers for this. I think we will touch that later on, but maybe that's
apart from that,
something about the like easy to adopt.
Sorry. Apart from that, there are some nice guides on how to get started with Kotlin. There are Kotlin cons, which is a set of practical examples to go through and get familiar with Kotlin. And there are also nice guides like Kotlin for Python engineers. So yeah, I guess it all makes it easier for people to adopt Kotlin.
What would you say? Why not Java? We have Kotlin and Scala very well presented in our stack, but why not Java?
Kind of feels like if the company didn't have any prior Java development, then there is no point in going with Java, because Kotlin is superior in many ways in terms of syntax sugar and working with multi-threading is a bit more convenient in Kotlin thanks to coroutines. So yeah, it's just more pleasant to use than Java, I would say.
Yeah, I have read from somewhere that the better Java, some describe it that way. I don't know if it's true or not. Okay, let's dive a bit deeper. Could you share a bit details of the Kotlin stack we have? So typically what kind of backend applications we have? What are the kind of database aspects, communication, web frameworks, and the like?
Yeah, so in our case, I guess we have pretty typical backend services, which are in most cases are simply API to put some data into the database or read through the data from the database. So in terms of REST API or rather frameworks, we typically use Spring Framework or Cater. Some teams have experimented with other frameworks, but there are not so many of those. We also use coroutines quite heavily, where we use Cater because that makes lots of sense. We use Gradle as our build tool, and some teams have adopted RTT for a more functional approach to programming in Kotlin. In terms of databases, we mostly use Postgres and Mongo. And to work with Postgres, we typically use Juke, which is a very nice sort of declarative library to work with the database, not an ORM like JPA or something like that. And to work with Mongo, we use official coroutine driver. Apart from that, for API, we also rely on gRPC. We use the official gRPC server provided by Google. And for messaging there, we use protobufs, and we also use Kafka quite heavily in our systems.
Yep, so I guess it's very similar for all the backend languages. So usually the consumer-facing endpoints are some REST JSON APIs, while gRPC protobufs are the preferred for service-to-service communication and or synchronous service-to-service communication, and then Kafka for if you don't need the response immediately or you're just informing that something happened for other services.
Yeah.
How about the continuous integration and deployment side? Could you share some insights?
Sure, yep. So we host all of our code on GitHub. So to run our pipelines, we use GitHub Actions, and we deploy everything to our case clusters in AWS. Apart from that, we also use our sort of custom-made abstraction on top of Terraform to configure our infrastructure. And we typically try to have separate deployments for services having multiple performance profiles. So, for example, if you have a Kafka consumer in the service and an HTTP API, we typically create two separate deployments for that. Yeah. And of course, it's our engineers' responsibility to configure their infrastructure and maintain it. So yeah, full responsibility there.
Yeah, I believe it might be different in some other companies, but yeah, we have the infra teams, but those are more as like supportive functions, while usually the product teams are able to own their stuff from start to the long journey during the life cycle of the deployed application. Great. You mentioned gates, maybe worth mentioning that we're talking about Kubernetes.
Yeah.
Just to be clear for all the listeners. Yes. So that's the typical stack and the CI/CD kind of things. We discussed that Kotlin is basically used in a wide variety of domains in our organization. So are there any differences between these domains considering how the stack looks like? Or is it that it's very similar in each, just that the business problems are different based on which domain the backend is built for?
I'd say the stack is typically quite similar. Yeah, it's mostly that the business problems are different because we all essentially solve the same issues, right? We want our service to be scalable, reliable, observable. So yeah, I guess main differences are that, for example, some of our groups prefer using Spring Framework more. Some other groups prefer using Ktor more. But yeah, there aren't any huge differences.
Okay, I think we could dive a bit deeper into the, let's say, stack and how it concretely looks like to develop Kotlin backends at Wolt. So I know for the past year or so, you have been building this thing called Kotlin Starter, which is an internal project. I know it has kind of revolutionized the developer experience of our Kotlin backend engineers. So we could start by, or if you could start by explaining the motivation behind this Kotlin Starter, maybe that would be a good bridge to actually try to explain what it is.
Sure. So before we had Kotlin Starter, what we typically had to start a service, there were repository templates on GitHub. There was one for, let's say, Ktor, one for Spring Framework. Apart from that, we had a few shared libraries, like a library for working with Ktor, providing authentication, and some other Vault-specific things. There's our internal gRPC library and some other internal libraries, mostly group-specific. And that provided us with some challenges. So, for example, one of the issues with having a repository template is that you can't easily propagate changes to that template. So if you need to change some of the infrastructure there, you'll basically have to create a PR to each and every service started from that repository, right? So that was one of the issues. Another issue is that without sort of an SDK-like solution, it's hard to propagate some best practices in terms of, let's say, I don't know, consuming messages from Kafka or working with the database. And another thing was, well, just starting a new service. Some of our engineers, like you mentioned before, are coming from Python, for example, right? So they might be unfamiliar with Gradle. And, well, mastering Gradle could be challenging sometimes. So that set of challenges required a solution, and Kotlin Starter hopefully is the solution for that.
All right. So kickstarting new projects was mentioned, SDK-like thing was mentioned. So could you try to explain on high level what this Kotlin Starter is about? What are the kind of essential core features of it?
So I would say that it's a sort of a Swiss Army knife for basically starting a new service that can provide you with all you need. It's pretty simple to start with. You just add a few lines of code to the Gradle settings file, select the features you want there. For example, maybe you want to have a REST API and you want to have Kafka consumer and the database. Then you select those features, and it will automatically configure all the dependencies for you. It will configure all the infrastructure, and it can even generate an example code for you on how to use those features. So yeah, that's basically the way to scale, to scale services, to scale best practices.
Is it also usable in existing projects which are not kind of started from scratch with Kotlin Starter in mind?
Yeah, it's given that it's actually a set of Gradle plugins and libraries with an umbrella top-level plugin. So if you want to start a new service, you can use this umbrella plugin to configure everything for you. If you want to use it in existing services, you can simply use either a library or one of the, let's say, smaller plugins. where if we talk about the structure there, let's say we have a database feature, right? That feature would have multiple artifacts. One of the artifacts there would be the library itself that provides you with classes to work with the database. And given how often people were having dependency issues with bringing transitive dependencies, I took a decision there to not bring any transitive dependencies with the libraries. So the library itself doesn't bring anything transitively. If you want to bring dependencies transitively, you can just apply a plugin for working with the database, which will configure the dependencies for you and bring this library and make life a bit easier.
So thinking about the benefits, the dependency management is clearly one. Kickstarting new services is probably the biggest one. And then adopting like library kind of things to existing services. So it's kind of a SDK in itself as well.
Yeah, and like one of the benefits there is that, let's say, if you started a service using Kotlin Starter, there is basically just one dependency that you have to update. So how we set it up is every week there is an automated dependency check in the Kotlin Starter repository, which updates all the dependencies and then releases a new version of Kotlin Starter, so that all projects using the Kotlin Starter can just update it and get all the recent versions of dependencies. And apart from that, Kotlin Starter also manages sort of packaging the service into a Docker image. So it does that with JIB. It's a Google plugin for packaging containers. And with that, we are able to even propagate JDK version updates to the underlying services or downstream services. So yeah, it's quite cool.
Could you explain a bit more in detail? Like, let's take the use case of kickstarting a new service. What is required from the user? You talked about the Gradle settings file. Would it be that I include the features I want, then run Gradle build, and then it spits out me like a full code repository with code examples for all the features that I would want to have?
Well, yeah, there is a separate Gradle task called generate examples there.
Okay,
so, yeah. If you want to start a service using example endpoints or example repositories, you can just do that. You can click generate examples and then just run Gradle build or Gradle run, and it will start a working service for you locally. One of the things it also does is manages containers for you locally. So if, for example, you need a Kafka container or a database container, it will also start everything up for you. So you basically don't have to worry about anything.
Neat. Regarding this auto-generated code examples, if I understand this correctly, is it like basically documentation on demand? I want to have this feature, please show me how it's done, or how should I use it? Is that the correct interpretation of this?
Yeah, exactly. That was the idea behind it. The problem that I have with documentation in, let's say, Confluence or other systems is that usually it gets outdated and it's kind of hard to keep it up to date with the actual software package. While this way, actually testing the generated examples is part of the CI for Kotlin Starter. So it will never generate a non-working example for you, which means that its sort of documentation is always up to date with the actual software. So yeah, you always get up-to-date examples that you don't even have to copy from somewhere. You can just generate them and run the service, and everything works.
Nice. Yeah, it hasn't been once or twice that I have faced outdated documentation issue, or let's say completely non-working example in documentation issue. So That sounds like a robust approach. And then maybe a bit more about the SDK-like things. So the Gradle plugins, what kind of features are supported there? Like what kind of things people get out of the box when starting new services?
You get REST API layer, or HTTP API layer in form of Cater. You also get all the things you need to work with the databases, be it Postgres or Mongo. You get security stuff like our internal libraries for service-to-service authentication. You get gRPC, you get Kafka clients and publishers. And yeah, apart from that, I tried to put a heavy emphasis on observability. So all those modules, all those plugins, all those libraries are guaranteed to be instrumented and provide you with meaningful metrics.
So basically, opt in to use a Kafka consumer and you get Datadog metrics out of the box.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Sounds super cool. You mentioned that Cater is the one for the HTTP API layer. And previously we discussed that also Spring is being used, especially in some teams or some product groups. Was this like a decision of yours from the get-go to only support Cater, or would it be super tricky to support both? How do you see it?
Well, with the current setup, I would say it is technically possible to have Spring there as well, but probably doesn't make much sense because Spring overall offers a very similar functionality to what we have there in Kotlin Starter. Also, some things are missing there. For example, Spring wouldn't be as straightforward, I would say, to use or as easy to include new features. You would still have to tackle dependencies there, integrate build script, and some other things. And yeah, it's just that I myself actually like Spring a lot. I gave some tech talks on Spring. I contributed to Spring, but working with engineers here at Wolt, where people might come from Python world or maybe we have quite, I would say that quite a strong culture of internal mobility within the company. So people often can move from, I don't know, maybe working on front end to working on back end. And in those cases, for people with no prior experience with Spring, I've noticed that it could be quite hard for them to troubleshoot when something goes wrong. And that was, I think, one of the main reasons to go for Cater, because it's way more simple. And I've noticed that people have less troubles adopting it.
Makes sense. And I think Kotlin is not the only language in which we have this competing web frameworks battles going on. And I think the situation kind of changes yearly. We're not stuck with any framework from a decade ago, but rather trying to follow how the language communities evolve and keep ourselves up to date. So you cannot avoid ending in some debates about which framework to use. Both usually have their arguments against and for.
Yeah, usually there is no silver bullet. There's just a set of pros and cons, and you have to pick something. Picking one framework is usually better than trying to go for two in terms of even building knowledge around that, right? Because you don't have to split your knowledge between two different frameworks.
Exactly, and then you don't have the separate silos of framework X developers, framework Y developers, and they cannot really easily contribute to each other's projects.
Yeah, exactly.
Could we dive even a bit deeper? So if I understand this Kotlin starter in high level, it's like you change something in the settings file, you run some Gradle some command, and then you get some changes reflected directly in your source tree, being dependency updates or generated code or whatever. Like, how did you come up with all this? What was your inspiration, and well, how did you implement this?
So my inspiration was just seeing people struggle with Gradle mostly. I realized that there has to be a way to make things simple, to make things declarative. And it turns out it wasn't just my idea at the time. At around the same time, it seems like folks at JetBrains came up with Amper, and folks at Gradle came up with declarative Gradle. So I just guess great minds think alike. And yeah, so I guess people were fed up with Gradle build scripts and needed something else. And well, how it works is, like I mentioned before, the starter is basically a set of Gradle plugins with an umbrella plugin that's configured through the settings file, where you just, when you select a feature, it applies a relevant plugin based on that feature. So that's pretty much it. It just applies configuration based on what you picked. And while the idea seems to be quite simple on the surface, to be honest, I haven't seen anyone doing anything like that before.
Great, that sounds simple but very elegant. How has our Kotlin community taken this Kotlin starter? I believe it has been out for around 6 months or so. So I believe there's already some adoption. What is your experience? How people view it, and how have they adopted it?
I guess people were quite happy with being able to start a new service from with the time of starting a new service going down from a few days or a week to just a few hours. That was nice. And apart from that, yeah, people were quite happy with how simple it is now. I mean, even I was quite impressed with how quick it was to start a new service back when we were working on our hackathon project. Basically, we got a working backend service in less than a day, fully working. Like, that's really nice, I think.
And how has been the adoption? Are there already like services in production which were initially created with Kotlin Starter?
Yeah, quite a few services, definitely more than 10. There are, I know, at least 5 services. Those were started with Kotlin Starter are definitely in production now. And I know that there are way more in development at the moment. So yeah, I mean, it's simply the simplest way to start a new service nowadays. So there is no reason not to go with it.
Great. So already quite a bit of adoption going on. How does the future look like? Do you have any plans on improving it further, maybe introducing some additional Gradle plugins? Do you have some wish lists somewhere where people can submit new ones, or how does it work?
Yeah, people actually contribute to it themselves, usually when they need something. That's the best way to move it forward, I think. But apart from that, yeah, some folks just create issues in the GitHub repository if they need some features. Plans for the future are mostly revolve around our infra setup, because at the moment when you start a new service with our internal developer portal called Wolt.dev, it generates some of the infrastructure, of the infra stuff for you, but not everything yet. And we are working on improving that. And yeah, there are, of course, new integrations on the plate. For example, AWS SDK integration, so that it's way easier to work with AWS, and maybe some other things.
Now that you mentioned Wolt.dev, so I could maybe briefly explain. It's a backstage-powered internal developer portal. So our internal name for that is Wolt.dev. And yep, that provides kind of a additional convenience layer for a Kotlin starter, especially when it comes to starting new services. So could you elaborate a bit, like how's the developer experience when you combine Kotlin starter with this Wolt.dev for kickstarting a new service these days?
So it's incredibly simple nowadays. It's sort of, in a way, it's similar to what you have with Spring Boot Initializer. Basically, you just go to this web portal and pick the features you want to have. You select if you want to have an HTTP API, if you want to connect to the database, and all the things I mentioned before. And then you just click next, and it creates everything for you. It creates the service repository, it creates the infra definition for your new service, and some other pull requests related to security in our infra. And that's basically, once you merge all the PRs it creates, you are ready to go. You can deploy a service to dev. And that takes a few minutes.
Yeah, so filling a form in UI, merging some pull requests, and then you basically have the initial version deployed in the development environment, if I understood correctly.
Yep.
Great. I think we could move on to the community aspect. So what kind of internal Kotlin community do we have? I believe we already mentioned that there are more than 150 monthly contributors in our Kotlin projects. And I think you mentioned that there are more than 200 people in the internal Kotlin knowledge Slack channel. Anything else? How do we share knowledge among our Kotlin peeps, and how's the community like?
So yeah, back to the Slack channel. Folks usually just ask questions there and get answers. We have pretty active community in that regard. Apart from that, people share tips and their battles they won. In addition to that, we also have engineering competence meeting that happens bi-weekly, where we share some knowledge, sort of engineering company-wide. And I know that many groups also have their internal knowledge sharing meetings. And we also have our engineering blog, where we share Kotlin stuff from time to time. And yeah, and overall, we have a pretty active community. We try to give back in terms of contributing to open source projects. For example, I maintain a few open source projects of my own, and I've contributed to Micrometer and AWS Kotlin SDK recently. And another member of our engineering team has recently created a repository with idempotency plugin for Cater. So yeah, we're trying to give back as much as we can.
Yep, indeed. In some cases, we are able to open source the internal code, but I believe in most cases it's too Wolt specific to make it kind of open sourceable. Okay, thank you for the insights. I think we could end this with the usual. So do you have any tips for organizations which are scaling their Kotlin backend development at the moment, or perhaps these tips might be applicable for any language?
I would say the tips I have are probably pretty generic, to be honest. So probably aiming for one stack would be a good idea, so that you don't get a spread of knowledge, so that it can be more focused. And yeah, ensuring the best practices are followed. Probably the easiest way for that would be to have some shared libraries or something like an SDK, and yeah, minimize toil for developers so that they can focus on solving business problems instead of, I don't know, sitting in the meeting.
Or battling with the dependency update or choosing the right library.
Or battling with the dependency updates, yeah.
Yeah. Great, thank you. I believe those tips were indeed very generic and applicable for basically any language. Thank you for this discussion. I enjoyed a lot. Hopefully listeners enjoyed as well. And see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.